At the dawn of the universe, before a grain of sand, a blade of grass, or a cool wave existed, there was only the boundless and bottomless silence of Ginnungagap. When the freezing mists of Niflheim in the north and the scorching flames of Muspelheim in the south met in this void, what emerged was not life itself, but a vast and formless chaos. The first giant, Ymir, was the embodiment of this uncontrolled force, that raw being born of sweat and ice. When young Odin, along with his brothers Vili and Ve, looked upon this immense, aimless mass, they saw not only an enemy, but also raw material. The mind of a strategist could sense the order hidden even in the greatest chaos. For Odin, existence was too precious to be left to chance. Slaying Ymir was not the result of ordinary ambition. It was the first and greatest feat of engineering the universe had ever seen. When the giant fell, his blood flowed to form rivers and seas, and Odin had already planned where each drop would be directed. He molded the earth from their flesh, erected impassable mountains from their broken bones, and stretched their skulls above their heads as the infinite dome of the sky. This was not destruction, but the taming of chaos. Yet as Odin stood in the midst of this colossal structure he had created, he knew that the mountains he had built and the rivers he had channeled were merely decorations. True power was not built on possessions, but on understanding the movement of every atom within those possessions. The walls of Asgard had not yet risen. The branches of Yggdrasil had not yet fully formed the invisible bridges between the realms. As Odin walked through this new world he had created, he felt that even the earth beneath his feet would one day tremble, that the whisper of the wind would one day turn into a scream. The unceasing restlessness within him cried out a truth. Order, by its very nature, is a fragile illusion. Every system he built carried within it the seeds of its own collapse, entropy. The ancient hatred of the giants, the silent spread of ice, and the insatiable appetite of fire were ready to devour the architecture they had created at any moment. When Odin parted from his brothers and gazed into the deep void at the center of the world, he understood that he could not sustain this system with physical force alone. Swords would dull, walls would crumble, and the more giants were killed, the more they would multiply. True sovereignty lay in knowing the enemy's next move before they even thought of it. He darkened his vision. The pieces on the great chessboard of his mind were not yet in place. A leader's greatest burden is to remain awake while everyone else sleeps, and to see the darkness beyond the light everyone else sees. To find his way in this darkness, he needed something ordinary beings could not possess, a kind of absolute vision. It was at that moment that he took his first step from being the designer of the universe to becoming its slave and protector. He understood that knowledge was not merely a tool, but the greatest weapon, yet the price of this weapon was so heavy that it could wound even a god. As the wind howled through the newly sprouting forests of Midgard, Odin's gaze turned far away toward the well of Mimir, the source of both wisdom and suffering. The first act had closed, chaos confined to order, but the story of the sacrifices that would be made to preserve this order was just beginning. The world was still very young, but Odin carried the weight of 1,000 years of weariness on his shoulders. As the golden palaces of Asgard rose, he was far too far-sighted to rely solely on the solidity of the walls. He had established a system, however. He needed more than ordinary sense to perceive its weak links, its future cracks, and its unseen threats. Knowledge was the most valuable currency of the 9 realms, and the guardian of this treasure was none other than the ancient giant Mimir.
Mimir stood guard beneath one of the roots of the world tree Yggdrasil, at the edge of that mysterious well where wisdom flowed like pure water.
Leaving behind his divine identity and magnificent armor, Odin set out in a simple traveler's cloak. This was not merely a physical journey, but a process of a leader confronting his own limitations. As he traveled through the freezing winds and treacherous paths of Jotunheim, a single question echoed in his mind. What is the price of knowing everything? When he reached the well, Mimir's gaze was as still as a deep lake, yet as powerful as a whirlwind. Mimir knew that every drop of this water held the universe's past, present, and yet to be written future. But drinking from this spring wasn't a reward that could be obtained simply by wishing. "Are you ready to pay the price?" Mimir asked. His voice was like a whisper from the depths of the earth. Odin didn't hesitate for a moment. Ruling an empire required accepting personal sacrifices. He wasn't just a god-king, but a strategist seeking to save the future of the universe. To see the future clearly, he had to leave one of his eyes, the eyes that saw the light of the world, in the well. This was more than a physical loss. It was a symbol that he would no longer see the world as before, that his perspective would change forever. When he sacrificed his eye, he saw not only his own reflection in those deep waters, but the flow of all time. With the first sip from the well, a massive stream of data poured into his mind. He could now see not only the trees, but the sap flowing through their veins, not only the wind, but the storms it would carry thousands of years later. This absolute vision had bestowed upon him immense power, but it also brought with it profound sorrow. He now knew not only where his enemies were, but also what they were thinking and what weaknesses they possessed. However, in the darkest corner of this vision lay the shadow of the inevitable, Ragnarök. Wisdom had brought with it a tragic realization. Knowing everything also meant experiencing every loss beforehand. When the concept of time vanished, Odin's consciousness seeped beyond the realms into that dark region where the physical world ended. Pain eventually became a guide, and the mist around him dispersed. In the very center of that absolute darkness, amidst the dust on the ground and the roots of the tree, he saw shimmering signs. The runes looked back at him. These were the formulas of victory, protection, destruction, and creation. Each sign represented a law of the universe. With his body at the point of exhaustion, Odin, with one last act of will, reached down. At that moment, pain and darkness gave way to a great enlightenment. He imprinted the runes on his mind, unraveling them one by one and incorporating them into his own being. When he fell from the tree, he was no longer merely a king or a prophet, but the first sorcerer to command the source code of the universe. Thanks to the runes, he could now make objects speak, neutralize his enemies' weapons, and, most importantly, use ancient secrets to control the will of others. These 9 nights of ordeal had taught him his greatest lesson. True power lay not in external armies, but in the knowledge of the symbols that govern the unseen. Knowledge, forged in suffering, transformed into lasting authority. Upon returning to Asgard, his hands were no longer merely ready to wield sword hilts, but to reshape reality by drawing runes in the air. However, possessing so much knowledge and power brought with it a new problem. How could a single mind keep track of the billions of data points evolving simultaneously across the 9 realms? He had the codes, but he needed a massive data collection network to learn at what point and by whom these codes were being tampered with. He turned his gaze to the sky. He knew he needed loyal wings there. Drinking from the fountain of wisdom and mastering the secrets of the runes had given Odin the ability to understand the fabric of the universe.
But the 9 realms were a living, breathing, and ever-changing organism. A leader couldn't simply foresee the future. He also needed to instantly perceive the now, the whispers, the negotiations behind closed doors, and the approaching minor disturbances. How could he, seated on his throne within the walls of Asgard, sense the rage of a giant or the ambition of a man thousands of leagues away? What he needed was an intelligence network, extensions of his own mind, invincible to emotions and distance. Then 2 black wings appeared on Odin's shoulders, Hugin and Munin. Their names were simple, but the power they represented was immense. Hugin meant thought, and Munin meant memory. They were not merely birds, but fragments of Odin's consciousness spread across the realms. Every morning, before dawn, they took flight from the high towers of Asgard, spreading their wings over the 9 realms. Hugin analyzed the events, read intentions, and deciphered the logic behind them. Munin, meanwhile, meticulously recorded everything, preserving the data without missing a single detail, maintaining the connection between the past and the present. These 2 ravens were the architects of the universe's first spy network. They were the first to hear and see when a giant was gathering an army in the depths of Jotunheim, when a dwarf was forging a forbidden weapon, or when a man was rebelling against his fate. Nowhere was impassable for them. They glided from the steepest cliffs to the darkest caves, gathering information like invisible shadows. When evening came and they returned to Odin's shoulders, they whispered every murmur, every image, and every secret they had gathered into his ear. In this way, Odin could keep his finger on the pulse of the entire universe without moving from his place.
However, this intelligence network came at a price. Odin felt a deep anxiety each evening as he awaited the return of his ravens. He feared especially for Hugin, or thought, for thought sometimes traveled so far that it might not want to return, or Munin, or memory, might be crushed and lost under the weight of the horrors it had witnessed. For a leader, the greatest risk was the contamination or complete cessation of data sources. If these 2 birds never returned, Odin would be condemned not only to silence, but also to strategic blindness. Dependence on information was a ruler's most hidden weakness. Thanks to the information brought by the ravens, Odin transformed from a passive observer into a proactive ruler. He could now intervene before threats reached his doorstep, determining precisely where to use diplomacy or force. The whispers of Hugin and Munin formed the basis of Asgard's strategic plans. But no matter how flawless the data flow, Odin needed a central point from which he could see this data as a whole, monitoring all realms from a single perspective. The information was reaching his ears, but now was the time to turn to that supreme point, Yggdrasil, where he would seal that information with his own eyes. Information flowed in from all directions. The whispers of ravens, the vibrations of runes, and the profound insights from Mimir's well filled Odin's mind. But a leader's greatest test is dealing with information overload. Data alone was meaningless. What mattered was seeing its context and its place within the whole. Odin had a throne built at the highest point of Asgard, in the heart of Valaskof's palace, a throne that was not merely a seat, but the optical center of the universe. This throne was called Yggdrasil.
The moment he sat on Yggdrasil, Odin's consciousness transcended physical boundaries, spreading like a net across the 9 realms. This throne offered him a divine panoramic view. He could hear the sound of dwarf hammers in the deepest caves and see how a giant in the distance clutched a goblet. Yggdrasil was more than a watchtower. It was a terminal connected to the nervous system of the universe.
From where Odin sat, he observed everything with instantaneous vision, from the internal strife of a kingdom in Midgard to the slightest flicker of light in Alfheim. This absolute surveillance gave Odin a unique psychological advantage. No one could hide any plan from him. Secrecy had lost its meaning under Hildskjalf's gaze. However, looking down from such a high vantage point had a dangerous side effect, becoming devoid of mercy while mastering details. For a strategist, when everything becomes a move, individuals become mere numbers. As Odin sat on his throne, watching the world unfold, he felt once again that he was both master and prisoner of the system he had created. Every conflict he witnessed, every injustice he failed to intervene in, was part of a larger plan. But protecting this grand plan sometimes required allowing small sparks to grow. Another truth he realized from Hildskjalf's perspective was the need for internal threats and diplomacy. Simply observing and knowing wasn't enough. There were some forces that couldn't be suppressed by brute force alone or sealed with runes. The tension with the Vanir gods in particular was gathering like a great storm beyond the walls of Asgard. As Odin rose from his throne, he knew the defensive phase was over. Now was the time to open up to the outside world, forge alliances, and, if necessary, manipulate his enemies to his side in order to make his established order sustainable.
His gaze was now harsher and more determined as he descended. The period of observation was complete. Now was the time to act, to sit at the table of diplomacy, and to assert Asgard's authority over other races. The first great war of the universe was at the doorstep, and Odin knew that the path to victory lay not only through the sword, but also through a cleverly orchestrated peace. Asgard's walls rose high. Odin's intelligence network spread across the realms like a spiderweb. Yet not every corner of the universe was ready to accept Asgard's authority. The Vanir gods, residing in Vanaheim, wielded the raw power of nature and the ancient arts of magic. They were a more fluid and unpredictable force, defying the disciplined and hierarchical order Odin had established. Watching this rising power from his throne in Hildskjalf, Odin realized the inevitable. Two suns could not coexist in the same sky. They would either submit or be destroyed. But this time, things did not go as he expected. When the war between the Aesir, the warriors of Asgard, and the mages of Vanaheim began, Odin saw his strategy falter for the first time. The power of Gungnir, his spear, and the ancient knowledge of runes were insufficient to overcome the Vanir's defenses, which were intertwined with nature. Victories won on the battlefield were reversed by magic the very next day. As the war dragged on, both sides were worn down, but neither could establish a decisive advantage. For Odin, this was unacceptable. For a strategist, an unwinnable war meant wasted resources and a weakening of the system. If you couldn't completely eliminate an enemy, you had to make them a part of the system.
When Odin decided to sheathe his sword and sit down at the negotiating table, it wasn't a surrender, but a much deeper move. The principle of make an ally of the enemy you cannot defeat became his new strategy. The peace treaty shouldn't remain merely on paper. The destinies of the two peoples had to be sealed together. Odin invited the most powerful figures of the Vanir, Nord, Lord of the Seas, and his children Freyr and Freya, to Asgard. While it appeared to be a hostage exchange, it was actually a skill transfer operation. He wanted to combine the Vanir's mastery over nature and the ancient magical techniques called Seid with the military discipline of Asgard. This diplomatic move forever altered the balance of power in the universe.
These new gods, emerging from enemy ranks, became not only allies, but also the most important protectors of Asgard. In the process, Odin learned profound magical secrets from Freya that he had never known before. Armies that had once sought to destroy each other were now united under one banner. With this move, Odin not only ended a war, but also neutralized a potential rival, making them a part of his own defense industry and magical capabilities. However, for peace to be sustainable, both sides needed guarantees. Odin knew that trust was built not just on words, but on living proof. This first step at the diplomatic table opened the door to history's most famous hostage exchange. Odin was preparing to send his most trusted advisors to ensure the permanence of peace and to set his sights on the depths of Vanaheim. The noise of war had ceased, but the chess game in their minds was more complex than ever.
Peace agreements become reality not when signatures are affixed, but when both sides have something to lose. To transform this fragile truce with the Vanir into a lasting alliance, Odin made one of history's riskiest diplomatic moves, a hostage exchange. This was not merely a show of confidence, but also an operation to place his most strategic assets in enemy headquarters. Odin chose 2 men to send to Vanaheim, Hoenir, known for his decisiveness, and Mimir, the greatest mind in the universe, and his advisor. From the outside, Hoenir appeared as a majestic, wise, and leadership-oriented god. Odin had envisioned him as a showcase manager to impress the Vanir people. But this was only one side of the coin. Hoenir's greatest weakness was his inability to make a single strategic decision without Mimir by his side. Mimir, with his quiet, profound intelligence, was the true brain, whispering every step into Hoenir's ear. Odin's plan was flawless. The Vanir would see a wise leader before them. However, all of that leader's decisions would actually pass through the filter of Odin's most loyal advisor. In Vanaheim, things initially went as planned. Hoenir made brilliant decisions with Mimir by his side, earning admiration in the councils. But the Vanir gods soon sensed something strange. Whenever Mimir was absent, Hoenir would fall silent, saying, "Let others decide." The Vanir suspected this was more of a deception than a diplomatic game. They realized that the leader sent to them was an empty shell, and that the real intelligence lay hidden in the mind of that silent old man. In a moment of anger and a feeling of betrayal, the Vanir people broke diplomatic rules.
However, acquiring this great power also isolated Odin further. As every word became a spell, every sentence a strategy, those around him could no longer discern when he was sincere and when he was manipulative. For a leader, persuasion was the greatest weapon, but also the most transparent mask. Now he had information, intelligence, and the power of persuasion. However, he also needed to learn to use his physical appearance as a tool to infiltrate enemy lines. For Odin, a leader's greatest ability was the ability to take the shape of the vessel he inhabited. The one-eyed king, seated on the majestic throne of Asgard, couldn't always act with the same grandeur. Some secrets were only hidden in whispered gossip around a fire, under a beggar's cloak. Some fortresses could only be conquered through cracks wide enough for a snake to pass through. Combining the ancient Satyr magic he learned from Freya with the mathematical precision of runes, Odin developed the most advanced infiltration techniques the universe had ever seen. In this process, Odin began to see his body as merely a tool, his identity as a changeable mask. At will, he could soar like an eagle over storms or transform into a salmon exploring the deepest passages. But his most dangerous transformation was when he donned the guise of the Traveler. With his wide-brimmed hat, ancient cloak, and staff, that old man wandering the lands was, in fact, the most dangerous intelligence agent in the universe.
He was a guest at the tables of humans and giants, gathering the true intentions they hid at the bottom of their glasses during their weakest moments. Shape-shifting wasn't just a physical transformation, it was a complete psychological infiltration operation. In every guise he assumed, Odin mimicked the nature of that being. When he took on the form of a giant, he donned its anger and arrogance. When he took on the form of an animal, it assumed its instincts. This allowed him to remain undetected behind enemy lines for years. For a leader, this method was the only way to access unfiltered, pure data that no envoy or spy could bring. However, this constant identity change began to shake Odin's own essence. For a mind that wore thousands of different masks, where was the true self? Each infiltration operation, each lie, and each new identity took a small piece of his soul with it. But he was ready to pay the price, because he knew that, to win a war, it wasn't enough to know your enemy. Sometimes you had to think like them, breathe like them, and see like them. Through these covert operations, Odin witnessed firsthand what was happening even in the darkest corners of Jotunheim and the secret alliances the giants were forming. These infiltration techniques laid the foundation for Asgard's security protocols. But during these expeditions, he not only came to know his enemies, he also discovered far deeper and darker secrets within these realms, secrets that would change the course of the universe. Now it was time to use this knowledge as leverage in the greatest bargaining chip he would ever face with the giants.
For Odin, Jotunheim was not just a snowy and rugged land inhabited by giants, but also an ancient repository of memory where the oldest records of the universe were kept. The giants were beings who existed even before the gods, witnessing the beginning of time. The knowledge they possessed was not merely strategic data, but the raw material of existence. However, defeating these giants through warfare wasn't always the most effective approach. Where brute force failed, Odin decided to launch a mental siege. This was the greatest diplomatic infiltration operation into the heart of Jotunheim. The target of this operation was Vafthrûdnir, one of the wisest giants in the universe. Odin, once again disguised as his famous wanderer, took the name Gagnrod and stepped into the giant's hall. This wasn't a diplomatic visit, but a duel of wits, a war of knowledge. In Scandinavian culture, a knowledge contest wasn't just a game, but a high-stakes bargain where the loser risked their life or all their secrets. Odin sat opposite the giant, runes in his pocket and cosmic data from Mimir in his mind. Vafthrûdnir was a giant known for his arrogance, believing that no one but himself knew the secrets of the universe. Odin caught him on his own playing field, questions. He asked about everything, from how the world was created to the trajectories of the sun and moon, from the source of the wind to the end of the gods. With each correct answer, he lowered the giant's guard. With each question, he revealed the giant's deepest strategic knowledge, the weaknesses of Jotunheim's defenses, and the ancient fears of the giants. In this bargain, Odin wasn't just acquiring information, he was digging into the giant's mind like a data miner. At the end of the bargain, Odin asked the one question the giant could never answer. What did Odin whisper in his son Balder at his funeral? This question sealed the giant's defeat, for only Odin knew this secret. By the time the giant realized that his opponent was no ordinary traveler, but the father of the gods, it was too late. Odin had amassed all of Jotunheim's cosmic secrets, the giants' future plans, and the ancient prophecies they held regarding the end of the universe. This victory gave Asgard a tremendous advantage. They now knew not only their enemy's power, but also its genetic memory and fears. However, possessing so many secrets made Odin an even more protective leader. Knowledge wasn't enough. A physical defense line, a defense industry, and a flawless logistics network were essential to protect it.
Returning from Jotunheim, Odin's mind was no longer filled with diplomacy, but with engineering projects that would make Asgard an impenetrable fortress.
From Lidskjalf, Odin saw the splendor of Asgard, but as a strategist, he saw only vulnerabilities. As tensions between the realms escalated, a wall to protect Valhalla, the heart of Asgard, and the unity of the gods was no longer a luxury, but a matter of survival. In the midst of this quest, an unidentified giant architect arrived at the gates of Asgard with an impossible offer. In just 3 seasons, he would build walls so strong and massive that no army could breach them. However, the price of this colossal project was equally high. In return for his labor, the architect demanded the sun, the moon, and Freya, the goddess of beauty. This was one of the most challenging cost-benefit analyses for a leader. The sun and moon represented the flow of energy and time in the universe. Freya was the symbol of peace and abundance. Odin could have initially refused this risk, but his unending pragmatism took over. Instigated by Loki, Odin agreed to a deal with the giant architect, offering an impossibly short time frame and harsh terms. His goal was to have the majority of the walls built for free and then find a loophole to evade payment before the deadline. Once construction began, Odin oversaw the process like a modern construction foreman. The giant architect, accompanied by his enormous horse Svadilfari, stacked stones at a speed unimaginable to even the gods. As the walls rose, the silhouette of Asgard began to change. It was no longer just a settlement, but a perfect military base. Odin personally controlled the placement of each stone and the vantage point of each tower. Logistics and engineering had surpassed brute force. However, as time ran out, they faced the reality that the architect would finish the job. The strategy had become a gamble.
In the final days of the agreement, Odin's free defense strategy was on the verge of collapse. If the walls were completed, the balance of the universe would be disrupted, the sun and moon would be lost. Odin here displayed the darkest trait of a leader, shifting the blame for his own mistakes onto others and changing the rules mid-game. He tasked Loki with resolving the situation. Ultimately, the architect was thwarted. The giant's true identity was revealed just as the walls were nearing completion, and the project was definitively ended with Thor's hammer. Asgard was now surrounded by impenetrable walls. These walls were not only a physical barrier, but also a symbol of psychological superiority. Odin learned an important lesson in this process. The best defense is always one that involves a degree of deception. But walls alone were not enough. Armies were needed to stand against them, and in the hands of those armies, the most technologically advanced weapons were needed to shine. He turned his gaze to the depths of the earth, to the fiery forges of the dwarf blacksmiths. The walls had risen, external security secured, but a fortress is only as strong as the range of the weapons within. To complete Asgard's defensive doctrine, Odin needed not just stone and earth, but technological superiority. At that time, the most advanced technologists in the universe were the dwarves, who lived 7 layers beneath the earth in the heart of mines of fire. They were unrivaled masters at manipulating matter and imbuing objects with runic functions.
To modernize Asgard's arsenal, Odin, instead of direct conflict, initiated a bidding process that sparked competition among the dwarves. The famous rivalry between Ivaldi's sons and the brothers Brock and Itri essentially became the universe's first defensive industry competition. Odin's role in this process was not merely that of a client, but also the ultimate overseer of the project. What he needed wasn't simple swords. He wanted intelligent munitions, each a strategic asset in its own right that never missed and always returned. The first weapon to emerge from the dwarves' forges was Odin's own weapon, Gungnir. This spear was not forged from ordinary metal, but from the fundamental energies of the universe.
Gungnir's greatest feature was its rune-encoded targeting system. Once thrown, no matter how strong the wind or how fast the enemy fled, the spear never missed its target. This was a precision strike weapon that gave Odin the ability to intervene and assassinate from a distance. For a leader, Gungnir was a physical manifestation of absolute authority and sound judgment. Then came the most iconic heavy artillery in history, Mjolnir. This hammer, created for Thor, was not just a striking tool, but also a weapon of mass destruction. It could shrink to fit in a pocket, but when thrown, it unleashed enough energy to shake a continent. As Odin watched the production of these weapons, he realized something. Technology wasn't replacing courage, but it was transforming courage into the power of an army. The dwarves also forged Draupnir, the golden ring that produced 8 more of itself every 9th night for Odin. This was the guarantee of an endless financial source and logistical flow for the Asgardian economy.
When the weapons arrived in Asgard, the balance of power shifted irrevocably in favor of the gods. Asgard was no longer merely a defender, but a superpower capable of performing surgical operations at any point, at any time. However, Odin knew that even the most advanced weapons couldn't compensate for one deficiency: speed. If a threat was too far away, even the world's most powerful weapon would be useless if it couldn't reach it in time. After engineering and the weapons industry, the next step was to establish that unique transportation network connecting all the realms and leveraging that speed advantage. Sleipnir was not an ordinary mount, but a marvel of biological engineering and the fastest means of transportation in the universe. When this being, born of Loki's strange and strategic relationship with his giant horse Svadilfari, was placed at Odin's disposal, the doctrine of transportation completely changed. His 8 legs gave him not only physical speed, but also the ability to cross dimensions. With Sleipnir, there was no longer a concept of distance for Odin. He could run on the seas, glide through the clouds, and most importantly, he could even cross the thin border between life and death, that is, the gates of Helheim, without difficulty. For Odin, Sleipnir was the epitome of rapid deployment. As a strategist, he knew that. The size of an army is limited by its deployment speed. With Sleipnir on his back, Odin could plot in Asgard at dawn, lead a battle in Midgard at noon, and attend an intelligence meeting in the depths of Jotunheim at nightfall. This mobility created an illusion of ubiquity on his enemies. The giants began to believe that Odin could be in more than one place at the same time because he could appear from anywhere, at any time. However, Sleipnir's speed was not only a military advantage, but also a tool of diplomatic pressure. In a universe where communication took months, Odin's orders and decisions spread among the realms with lightning speed. This situation prevented local authorities from acting on their own and made them feel like the central authority was breathing down their necks at all times. Speed had become one of the strongest bonds that kept the hierarchy afloat. However, Odin's logistics vision could not be limited to this. Sleipnir was a marvel of individual transportation, but a more stable, wider, and more systematic channel was needed for the movement of masses and large armies between realms. A single cavalryman could win a war, but an army could only maintain order by crossing a bridge. After Odin increased his individual speed to the top with Sleipnir, he turned his eyes to that flickering beam of light at the entrance of Asgard. It was time for the Bifrost, the main highway between the realms, to operate at full capacity. The Bifrost was not just a visual spectacle, but a cosmic highway connecting the 9 realms. This shimmering bridge of light, linking Asgard to other worlds, was the universe's most critical logistical point. For Odin, the Bifrost meant central control.
If all roads led to this bridge, whoever controlled it controlled all traffic, trade, and military movement in the universe. However, such a critical passage was also its greatest security vulnerability. For an enemy army to seize the Bifrost would be like stabbing a dagger directly into the heart of Asgard. Odin needed more than just an ordinary guard to protect this strategic point. He placed Heimdall there, a being whose senses transcended godlike limits, who never slept and who knew no weariness. Heimdall's task was simple but vital. He would sit in the Himinbjorg Tower at the bridge's entrance and detect any infiltration attempts before they even began. Heimdall could hear the growth of a blade of grass hundreds of miles away and see the movement of an ant even in the darkest night. This was the pinnacle of Asgard's early warning and border security.
The use of the Bifrost was strictly regulated by Odin. Every crossing was recorded, every movement tracked. Thanks to this bridge, Asgardian armies could reach their target point at the most unexpected moment and in the shortest time. This was the perfect application of the internal maneuver in military literature. Odin stood at the center, instantly extending his arms to each of the 9 realms through the Bifrost. The bridge transformed speed into a weapon, while Heimdall's presence sealed this speed with absolute security. However, the Bifrost had another characteristic, its fragility. Odin knew that if one day the great catastrophe, Ragnarök, came, this bridge would not only be a passage, but also a place for sacrificial rituals. Therefore, securing the Bifrost was not only a physical defense, but also a psychological deterrent. Enemies, upon seeing Heimdall's gaze and the grandeur of the bridge, understood once again just how impassable the path to Asgard was. The Bifrost was Asgard's gateway to the outside world, but for a leader, simply holding the gate wasn't enough. If an infiltration occurred or a great army gathered in a distant land, all of Asgard needed to awaken in unison, in the same rhythm. Visual surveillance was in Heimdall's eyes, but that final warning sound, which would shake all realms, was needed. Odin had already determined the location of the Gjallarhorn, the colossal instrument that would complete the logistical and defensive plan. Heimdall, standing guard over the Bifrost, was not merely a guardian, but the universe's most sensitive sensor. But how could he simultaneously alert all of Asgard and its allies across the realms to a perceived threat? To solve this problem, Odin devised the Gjallarhorn, a mythical communication technology. This horn was not made of ordinary brass or bone. Its sound vibrated not the air, but the very fabric of reality itself. A single blow of the Gjallarhorn meant status orange. 2 blows meant total mobilization. For Odin, this horn was a strategic deterrent. Enemies knew that if the Gjallarhorn's sound echoed, all of Asgard's dormant cells would awaken, and every god and warrior would arm themselves simultaneously. This was the greatest emergency protocol a leader could possess. The Gjallarhorn created a collective sense of defense beyond individual acts of heroism. When its sound was heard, everyone from a farmer in Midgard to a warrior in Valhalla would remember they were part of the grand plan and take their place. But the darkest aspect of this warning system was that its sound would be heard not only by the living, but also by the dead and the ancient powers. The Gjallarhorn was, in fact, a countdown device. Odin knew that this horn would only emit its loudest and most terrifying sound once, when that inevitable end came. Therefore, the presence of the Gjallarhorn was both a guarantee of security for the people of Asgard and a constant reminder of an impending apocalypse. As a leader, Odin used this controlled fear as a tool of governance to keep his people combat-ready at all times.
The defense industry, logistics networks, and early warning systems were complete. Asgard was now a technological and architectural superpower. But that great strategic gap in Odin's mind still remained. Flawless weapons and swift horses were merely piles of metal without the ideal will to wield them. A war couldn't be won by machines or gods alone. It required a fearless, unwavering human force willing to risk everything. Odin turned his gaze from the walls of Asgard down to Midgard, where humans lived. There, among the mortal souls who had perished on the battlefields, he saw the nucleus of his eternal army. The time had come to shift from engineering to human resources. Operation Valhalla. The lines of defense had been established. Now he would deploy those renowned talent scouts, the Valkyries, to defend them. Asgard's walls were impenetrable, its weapons flawless, yet Odin knew very well that the true strength of an empire came not from stone or metal, but from its human resources. The gods were powerful, but few in number. When the great crisis of the future, Ragnarök, arrived, divine powers alone would not suffice. A vast infantry army would be needed to defend every square centimeter. Odin's strategy at this point was to use the mortal world as a talent pool, but to select only the best, the bravest, and the most loyal from this pool. A professional selection committee was needed. This is where the Valkyries, the shining wings of the sky and war, came into play. The Valkyries were Odin's personal headhunters. They were not only warrior women, but also highly analytical observers. When they descended upon a battlefield, they didn't just look at who was winning. What mattered to them was a soldier's stance in the face of defeat, his will in the face of death, and the loyalty he displayed in the most desperate moments. Odin's instruction was clear. Bring me not only the victors, but also those who see death as an honor and war as a way of life. This was the most comprehensive and meticulous selection operation in history. As the Valkyries glided across the bloody battlefields of Midgard, they scanned like an X-ray machine for the courage emanating from the tip of a spear or the unwavering resolve behind a shield.
The most critical part of this talent-hunting strategy was the selection criteria. Odin knew that technical skill, sword-wielding ability, could be trained, but character, courage, and a culture of self-sacrifice was innate. The Valkyries selected the most brilliant among the heroes who had lost their lives on the battlefield and carried them to Asgard. This selection process became a source of motivation among mortals. Being chosen for Valhalla became the highest career pinnacle a human could reach. Odin transformed death from an end into an interview to be passed in order to become part of an elite army. Thus, the battles in Midgard became testing grounds that nourished the army of Asgard. Every soul brought by the Valkyries was a new force added to Odin's vast database. However, the ethical and psychological burden of this operation was heavy. Sometimes the Valkyries had to allow a hero to die prematurely, even interfering with the strings of fate in order to choose them. Strategy sometimes had to feed tragedy. From his palace balcony, Odin could hear the sound of wings. Each sound was a harbinger of a new talent, a new human resource being added to the system. But simply bringing these chosen souls, the Einherjar, wasn't enough. They needed to be cleansed of their mortal habits, adapted to the military discipline of Asgard, and prepared for battle in an unending cycle. The gates of Valhalla were wide open, but the process that began inside would transform into a far more rigorous and disciplined training camp than the war outside.
Odin was now preparing to refine this raw material and create the most perfect army in the universe. Each soul chosen by the Valkyries and transported across the Rainbow Bridge to Asgard had left their mortal identity behind in the muddy lands of Midgard. They were now the Einherjar, the army of the chosen ones, those who fought alone. Odin's creation was the most radical human resources project in military history. For Odin didn't just want a powerful army. He sought an eternal legion with zero logistical costs, no problems with supplies or shelter, and, most importantly, one that had long since conquered the fear of death. When the massive gates of Valhalla opened for these warriors, what awaited them inside was not just an endless feast, but the most disciplined military rehabilitation process in history. As a strategist, Odin had found a way to keep his army's morale and motivation at the highest level, a system of ritual and reward. The splendor that greeted the Einherjar as they entered through Valhalla's 540 gates constantly reminded them why they were there. Every evening they fed on the meat of Saerhimnir, the pig cooked in enormous cauldrons and resurrected daily, and drank the finest sherbet flowing from the udders of Hydron the goat. But this luxury wasn't meant to create complacency. It was to buy the warriors' loyalty at a predetermined price. Odin offered them a life unimaginable to a mortal, demanding in return absolute obedience and an undying fighting spirit. The Einherjar's greatest characteristic was its reliance on the sustainable warrior model. In traditional armies, when a soldier died or was wounded, that unit lost its function, and it took years to train a replacement. In Valhalla, however, Odin manipulated time and biology with the power of runes and magic. The Einherjar awoke at dawn each day, went out into the courtyard, and mercilessly slaughtered one another. Limbs were severed, swords pierced chests. But when the sun set, all wounds healed, severed limbs grew back, and the dead were resurrected for dinner. This cycle pushed the warriors' abilities to their limits, while making them completely insensitive to pain and death. For Odin, this was the greatest technological advantage an army could possess, a force that never diminished, whose experience grew exponentially each day, and which would never retire.
However, even this perfect army had a weakness: keeping this immense force under control. Holding thousands of angry and war-oriented souls under one roof without them actually destroying each other required immense leadership skills. At this point, Odin sealed the hierarchy with runic laws. He approached them not merely as soldiers, but as chosen sons. Each Einherjar saw themselves as Odin's personal bodyguard and an indispensable part of the grand plan. This sense of belonging was the strongest cement ensuring the army's internal cohesion. From the balcony of Valhalla, Odin watched this relentless training, transforming his pawns on the chessboard into the most powerful pieces. He now commanded a legion capable of shaking worlds at his word, a legion that viewed death as a mere playmate. But this army needed a true test, a descent into battlefields where real blood was shed and strategic outcomes were decided. The presence of this flawless army in Valhalla would make Odin's geopolitical moves in Midgard even bolder, for he knew that if enough wars didn't break out in the world, Valhalla's ranks would never be filled. Valhalla's vast courtyard, Yggdrasil, was more than just an arena. It was the universe's most advanced tactical training center and a living war simulation. For a strategist, possessing an army wasn't enough. They had to constantly update their reflexes to adapt to changing battlefields and unpredictable enemy tactics.
Odin hadn't simply equipped the Einherjar with brute force, he had subjected them to a data processing cycle that began anew each morning and continued until sunset. With the dawn of each day, thousands of warriors lined up as if in the midst of a real battle, attacking each other with the most deadly maneuvers. This was the most extreme and flawless version of live exercises in modern military literature. Behind this relentless training lay Odin's runic intellect. Every battle in Valhalla was, in essence, a rehearsal of possible Ragnarok scenarios. Odin, watching this massive simulation from his throne Lidskalf, analyzed which formations were most effective against the giants, which maneuvers broke through the lines most quickly. Since death was not the end for the Einherjar, the warriors took risks they would normally never have dared to take, experimenting with the wildest and most creative attack tactics. In this process, Odin was developing the collective intelligence of his army. When a soldier died thousands of times, he no longer needed to consider what the mistake was. His body and mind coded the correct move as a reflex. This was the greatest software update an army could ever have.
But these simulations weren't just physical. Odin was also turning his warriors into blocks of ice psychologically. This daily cycle of violence in Valhalla completely eliminated strategic weaknesses like mercy and hesitation. As warriors beheaded their comrades in the battlefield the next morning, after having toasted them at dinner together, they learned not to let emotional bonds overshadow their resolve on the battlefield. For Odin, a soldier had to be a precision munition, devoid of emotion, merely following commands and locking on to the target. Valhalla was the factory of this cold-bloodedness. Another hidden purpose of Odin's training was to conduct a strategic test. Among the thousands of Einherjar, he observed which spirits could organize others, which minds could establish order amidst chaos. He would need a commander at every gate in the great war to come. Therefore, the simulations in Valhalla were made more challenging with constantly changing scenarios. Sometimes a castle siege, sometimes a forest raid, sometimes open field battles. Every evening, when wounds healed and the feast began, Odin would silently walk among them, noting who had gained strategic depth and who remained merely sword-wielding fighters. In the end, this endless cycle in Valhalla had surpassed Asgard's military capacity far beyond the realms themselves. But there was a problem. This perfect training camp needed a constant supply of new raw material, fresh and skilled warrior spirits. If peace reigned in Midgard, Valhalla's capacity would not be filled and the army would age. Odin faced a great strategic dilemma. To grow his army and recruit the best, he needed to foster controlled chaos, not peace in the mortal world. Simply watching was no longer enough. The time had come to stir up discord in Midgard and ignite wars to create heroes. Odin entered the dreams of kings, whispering in their ears and transforming seemingly insignificant disagreements into colossal blood feuds. For him, Midgard was a chessboard, and humans were the fruit ripening for Valhalla. A rune of superiority thrown between two peaceful tribes, or a suspicion of treason planted in a king's mind, would quickly turn battlefields into seas of blood. But Odin's aim wasn't just destruction. He sought those special souls who would rise from this destruction, achieve the impossible, and push the limits. Peace rewarded mediocrity. War, however, crystallized and revealed true talent and unwavering will. The darkest aspect of this strategy was that Odin sometimes betrayed even his favorite heroes. Just as a warrior was about to achieve victory, Odin would personally intervene, breaking their sword or strengthening their enemy's hand.
While seemingly cruel at first glance, from Odin's perspective, it was harvest time. A hero must die at the height of his glory and power, so that his potential can be incorporated into Asgard's army in its freshest form. Odin, by creating great tragedies in Midgard, inscribed epics, and these epics inspired new generations to become warriors. Thus, a self-sustaining cycle of hero production was established. While humans prayed to the gods for peace, Odin gave them more war, because only great wars gave birth to great souls. These subversive operations were carried out in complete harmony with Asgard's intelligence network. The ravens Hugin and Munin reported to Odin which kingdom's army was more disciplined and which prince possessed the potential of a chosen one. Based on these data, Odin determined the points of intervention. Sometimes he weakened a shield, sometimes he directed an arrow to its target. He was the greatest agitator in the universe. From the moment his hand touched them, brother turned against brother, and allies turned their backs on each other. But as a result of this chaos, thousands of new souls, the finest, most ambitious, and most skilled in the art of war, poured into Valhalla every evening.
Odin's strategic human harvest transformed Asgard into a military giant. However, viewing everything as merely a number or a pawn sometimes gave rise to powers too great for the system to control. Alongside these general harvesting operations, Odin also conducted special projects that he personally oversaw, shaping their genetics and destinies. Ordinary heroes formed the army, but sometimes a figure was needed who alone could be worth an entire army and defeat even the darkest monsters. Odin turned his gaze to the noblest and most tragic lineage of Midgard. The time had come to prepare his greatest pawn, Sigurd. Sigurd's training was far different from that of an ordinary soldier. Odin, once again disguised as his famous Wanderer, appeared before young Sigurd. He whispered to him not only how to fight, but also how to understand the language of nature and the weaknesses of his enemy. The sword Gram, given to Sigurd, was an ancient weapon that Odin himself had thrust into the trunk of a tree, and which only the Chosen One could pull out. Odin placed a colossal obstacle before Sigurd, Fafnir, the dragon transformed into a monster by his ambition. This was not only a test of heroism for Sigurd, but also a biological upgrade operation. Odin knew that killing the dragon wasn't enough. He had to absorb its ancient power into his own being. When Sigurd slayed Fafnir, cooked the dragon's heart, and its blood touched his skin, the transformation Odin had planned took place. Dragon blood forged Sigurd's skin into an impenetrable armor, granting him the ability to understand the language of birds. He was no longer an ordinary man, but Asgard's most powerful and best-equipped pawn on Earth. Using Sigurd, Odin both controlled the curse of gold and Varinot and instilled fear in the world of giants. But for a strategist, the most powerful pawn is also the riskiest. Sigurd's immense power and fame transformed him from a mere soldier into a man of untamed will even the gods themselves struggled to control.
But the most challenging task for a risk manager is to predict when this evil under control will become uncontrollable. Loki was more like a suicide bomber than an ally, ready to explode at any moment. Odin was actually taking a big gamble when he made Loki share Asgard's most intimate secrets. Keeping him at the table was the only way to prevent him from joining with the giants outside and fundamentally destroying the system. Odin applied the principle of keep your friends close, your enemies closer to the extreme. Each of Loki's betrayals was a new input for Odin. He was measuring its weaknesses, its connections, and its capacity for destruction by experiencing it firsthand. But every risk management plan has an expiration date.
Odin began to sense that one day Loki's intelligence would evolve to a point even darker than his own, and that instead of closing the system's vulnerabilities, he would exploit those vulnerabilities. Loki was no longer just a problem solver, but was becoming a deadly virus of the system itself. As Odin ponders how long he can keep his chaotic partner in orbit, the shadow of a threat to Asgard's purest and most beloved existence begins to loom. Risk management was no longer a game of diplomacy, but was about to turn into an absolute war of survival. Baldur was Asgard's last hope against the dark Ragnarok prophecies. But when Baldur began having nightmares about death, Odin panicked strategically. A leader losing his composure and overactivating his defenses sometimes invites disaster. Odin's wife, Frigg, made every being in the universe, fire, water, metals, animals, and plants, swear an oath not to harm Baldur. This was the most comprehensive absolute shield operation in history. Now nothing could harm Baldur. The gods threw spears at him for amusement, watching the weapons ricochet. Odin believed the system was now unhackable. However, every system has a small back door that even its creator couldn't see. Loki found the only loophole in this security wall: mistletoe. Frigg had forgotten to make an oath on this plant because she found it too young and harmless. Using this information, Loki crafted an arrow from mistletoe and placed it in the hand of Baldur's blind brother, Hod. Thinking it was a joke, Hod fired the arrow and Baldur died instantly. This was the moment Odin's strategic world came to a standstill. Neither Gungnir, nor runes, nor the thousands of soldiers in Valhalla could prevent this death.
With Baldur's death, Asgard's moral superiority vanished. A leader's greatest mistake is underestimating the intelligence of their enemy and believing their own defenses are impenetrable. Loki had found and exploited the weakest point in Odin's strict and disciplined order. After this tragedy, Odin realized something. Some events are inevitable, and strategy is sometimes not about preventing disaster, but about surviving it. As Baldur's body was cremated, the period of prevention was over in Odin's mind. Plans for final resistance and rebirth had begun. After this event, Odin had Loki captured and chained 7 layers beneath the earth. However, this was not a victory, but a delay. The virus had already spread throughout the system. With Baldur's departure, the winter between the realms, Fimbulwinter, began. Risk management had failed. Odin now knew that there was no escape. Now was the time for all those preparations, those massive armies, and the sacrificed eye to prepare for their true purpose, Ragnarök, the final war of the universe. When Baldur died, his spirit fell into Helheim, a misty and freezing realm ruled by Hel, Loki's daughter. For Odin, this was not only the loss of a child, but also a loss of a resource outside the system he governed. Helheim was an autonomous region with its own rules and border administration, over which even Odin could not establish absolute authority. Odin knew that sending an army there was impossible. It was governed not by brute force, but by the laws of death. Therefore, he sent his swiftest envoy, Hermod, aboard Sleipnir on the darkest diplomatic mission in history. This was not a rescue operation, but a negotiation for rehabilitation. Odin made an offer to Hel. Hel, in turn, put forward the condition of absolute consensus in modern diplomacy. If all living and dead weep for Baldur, I will return him. This was the first globally implemented strategic vote in history. Odin sent his ravens to all the realms. He wanted everyone from giants made of stone to trees to gods to participate in this diplomatic decision. But no matter how inclusive a leader's plan, a single veto could lock the entire process. Loki, disguised as Thok, sabotaged this global consensus by refusing to weep. Odin learned a crucial lesson from this failed diplomatic maneuver. Border management with the realm of the dead was not just a matter of diplomacy, but a matter of risk transfer. Baldur would not return, but his presence there guaranteed that the gates of Helheim would one day open against Asgard. Odin redefined his relationship with Helheim. Now, death was no longer just a promotion for the heroes chosen for Valhalla. It carried the potential of an enemy army formed by those outside the system, those who died of sickness and old age. Odin placed more spies on the Helheim border and began monitoring the movements of the dead there.
In this process, Odin placed the strategy of the inevitability of death at the center of his survival plan. If even his favorite son couldn't escape the cold chains of Helheim, the system was coming to an end. Helheim diplomacy showed Odin the universe's greatest weakness. Everything has an end, and that end comes from those closest to you at your weakest moment. As Odin returned from the mists of Helheim, he had abandoned his rescue plans and switched to damage control mode. Baldur's continued presence would be the opposing side's greatest asset in Ragnarök. It all began with the dark and unsettling dreams Baldur was having. These dreams were the first major crack in Asgard's cosmic data network. Odin knew that these dreams weren't just fantasies, but raw intelligence data leaking from the source code of destiny. Baldur was the purest point in the system, and the attack had begun precisely there, through his dreams. For Odin, this was an early warning signal of the end of the universe. If the system's most beloved being was seeing his own demise, it wasn't just an individual crisis, but a cyber attack against the entire Asgard regime. Taking this leak seriously, Odin personally went on a field investigation. Disguised with his dog, he went to the tomb of a dead prophet, Volva. Using necromancy, he awakened him and asked what these dreams meant. The answer was clear. The realm of the dead is preparing a feast for Baldur. This was confirmation of the intelligence. However, Odin made a strategic mistake at this point. Instead of eliminating the threat, isolating Loki, or altering the course of fate, he implemented a passive protection plan focused on minimizing the threat's impact.
This protection plan was Frigg's famous oath to every object in the universe. This is what is known in strategic literature as an attempt to build a deep defense. Odin and Frigg, by individually persuading each object, built an immune armor against Baldur. However, such massive security protocols create two major vulnerabilities. First, they create a false sense of security, overconfidence. Second, they overcomplicate the system, allowing even the smallest gap, like mistletoe, to become a vital threat. The gods became so convinced that Baldur was now immortal that they completely relaxed their defensive reflexes. For Loki, this situation became a simple cryptographic game to be solved. In a system where everything was sworn to, what Loki did was exception handling. The tiny mistletoe Frigg overlooked was the only open port within the massive protective shield. Even Odin's intelligence unit, the Ravens, failed to notice this detail. They were focused on the movements of large armies and giants. The fact that a small plant could bring down the air to a vast empire was the biggest blind spot in Odin's macro-strategic perspective. This process taught a leader the most painful lesson. If a leak begins, no matter how high you build the walls, the virus inside will find a way to breach them. This process, which began with Baldur's dreams, marked the end of Asgard's myth of absolute security. The protection plan, in fact, provided Loki, the architect of the catastrophe, with a roadmap showing him exactly where to strike. Odin held a grand feast to celebrate the success of the system he had established to protect Balder. The gods watched as Balder remained unharmed after being pelted with weapons, proudly boasting of the strength of the protective shield. This was a moment of strategic blindness, the pinnacle of underestimating the enemy and the passivity of defense. Loki, meanwhile, silently mingled among the crowd, like a hacker who had discovered an architectural flaw in the system. The critical information he received from Frigg, that mistletoe was excluded from the oath because it was too young, was the key to the system's back door.
Fimbulwinter began with the first of 3 great, uninterrupted winters. This wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a cosmic energy blackout that began with the sun and moon being swallowed by giant worms. For Odin, this was the moment when his worst-case scenario analyses became reality. With the withdrawal of light and heat, agriculture collapsed in Midgard and other realms, famine ensued, and resource management became impossible. As a strategist, Odin knew that, when the stomach was empty, morality and loyalty would be the first values to be abandoned. As a matter of fact, it happened. Under the pressure of Fimbulwinter, all ties between people were broken. Brother killed brother. Fathers betrayed their sons. This was the complete evaporation of social capital. While Odin was watching the world from the balcony of Valhalla, he saw how the order he created had fallen into a swamp of chaos. But this chaos also had a strategic function. Fimbulwinter eliminated the weak, leaving only the toughest, most ruthless, and most resilient. For the grand finale of Ragnarök, the universe was literally being put through a huge stress test. Odin switched to a policy of austerity during this crisis. He directed Asgard's resources entirely towards military mobilization. New walls were no longer being built, only weapons were being repaired. The Einherjar army was training harder every day with a closed-circuit system inside Valhalla, because while the world outside was freezing, the anger inside needed to be kept warm. Odin began to listen more carefully to the whispers of the runes in this darkness, because in times of crisis, information was more valuable than bread. He was calculating how his enemies, giants and monsters, united in this cold, when Loki would break his chains and when the great wolf Fenrir would be freed. Fimbulwinter showed Odin the most painful side of leadership. Sometimes you had to sacrifice the masses you couldn't save. He was taking a position not to protect humanity, but to win the last war. In this process, even the Bifrost, Asgard's logistics lines, had reached freezing point. Transitions were risky and energy was low. Odin sensed that this great winter was just the beginning, that a huge fire would break out from under the ice. Crisis management was no longer a managing process, but a phase of gathering strength for the last hit.
The strategic depth of the betrayal lay in the fact that Loki did not personally carry out the attack. Instead of attacking directly, Loki used an element within the system itself, Balder's blind brother, Hod. This was a social engineering operation. By drawing Hod into the game, he gave him the mistletoe spear and helped him aim. In the feast hall personally overseen by Odin, in full view of his most trusted gods, the system's weakest link, Hod, struck its most valuable asset, Balder. When the mistletoe pierced Balder's chest, not only did one god die, but Odin's theory of a predictable world was shattered. This moment was the collapse of the strategy, because Odin had looked for the threat in the wrong place. He had held Bifrost against the armies of the giants, sealed everything with runes, yet the betrayal came from a plant within the palace and the hand of a brother. A profound silence fell over Asgard when Balder fell. This silence was a leader's worst nightmare, an unanswered question and an irreversible mistake. Despite all his wisdom, Odin had failed to calculate that the smallest variable, the the mistletoe could produce the greatest consequence: apocalypse. Loki's move fundamentally destroyed Asgard's defensive doctrine. No oath, no rune, and no wall could now reassure the gods. The mistletoe betrayal went down in history as the most poignant example in strategic literature of how the seemingly insignificant part of a system could trigger a systemic collapse. Odin, standing over his son's lifeless body, was defeated not only as a father, but also as a strategist. The period of protection and prevention was officially over. The cold breath of the inevitable was now palpable. This great upheaval in the system also disrupted universal balances. With Baldur's departure, the light was extinguished, and a dark, cold period dawned. Odin knew that all realms would pay the price for his mistake. Now he had to enter that relentless 3-year winter that would follow this great collapse, that final stretch where resources would be depleted and order would be utterly destroyed.
At the meeting, not only the military forces but also the intelligence network presented their latest data. Hugin and Munin provided the coordinates of the enemy coalition, the giants led by Loki, the army of the dead, and the fire giants of Muspelheim. Using this information, Odin devised a confrontation strategy in the Vigrid field. This was a field control maneuver aimed at drawing the enemy's forces to a single point and destroying them there. Although Odin knew the outcome would be destruction, he meticulously planned each move to inflict the heaviest price on the enemy. This final meeting was also the last official act of the Asgardian bureaucracy and hierarchy. As the meeting drew to a close, Odin pushed aside the rune tablets on the table. The planning phase was over. The execution phase had begun. As the hall emptied and the warriors dispersed to don their armor, Odin pondered only one thing. What kind of legacy would this magnificent order he had established leave for those who would come after him? The mobilization was complete. Now all the veins of the universe beat for war. As the rainbow bridge Bifrost began to tremble under the weight of the gods and armies, Heimdall took a deep breath and pressed the mouthpiece of the Gjallarhorn. That first note would be the announcement that the strategy was finished and the greatest battle in history had begun. The plain of Vigrid was 100-league-wide arena of destruction. Odin stood at the forefront of his army, atop Sleipnir and wielding Gungnir, his aim never wavering. Facing him was the greatest alliance of evil history had ever seen. The giant wolf Fenrir, unleashed from his chains, the venomous world serpent Jormungand, the army of giants arriving aboard the ship of the dead Nagfar, and the fire giant Surtur, waiting to reduce everything to ashes. For Odin, this was the greatest risk materialization a leader could face. Everything he had tried to avoid for millennia was now embodied in a single battlefield.
When the battle began, the disciplined structure Odin had built gave way to a terrifying roar. As the Einherjar army clashed with the giants, the effectiveness of Odin's runic training became evident. Each warrior showed no hesitation, having experienced death thousands of times on the training ground. But the enemy was just as well prepared. Odin's direct target was the greatest threat destined for him, Fenrir. This was a strategic duel, a clash between the protector of order and uncontrollable savagery. Odin hoped that everything would end when he hurled Gungnir, but fate, Vörd, could sometimes render even the most perfect ammunition ineffective. Elsewhere on the battlefield, Thor and Jormungand were engaged in a cycle of mutual assured destruction. Heimdall and Loki, as the two opposing poles of the system, destroyed each other. Each death meant the burning, one by one, of Asgard's millennia-old investment.
When Odin perished between Fenrir's massive jaws, he was making the greatest sacrifice a leader could make, personally leading the collapse of the system. Odin's death was not a defeat, it was the official closing of the old, weary, and secretive Old World Order. At the end of the war, Surtur, with his flaming sword, set the entire world and Yggdrasil ablaze. This is what strategic literature calls a hard reset. Everything Odin had built with runes, walls, and warriors was reduced to ashes. But when the smoke cleared, the fruit of Odin's greatest and most secret strategy was revealed. He hadn't just planned the destruction, he had also chosen those who would survive it. Baldur's return from Helheim and the establishment of a new order by the surviving young gods was the final and most successful move in Odin's plan for sustainability.
Odin was gone, but his legacy, the thirst for knowledge, the importance of preparedness, and the power of sacrifice was already etched into the foundations of the new world. When the blood on Vigrid Square dried, a green sprout rose from the ashes. This was an emperor's greatest triumph, to ensure that even after his own demise, the system would be reborn in a purer form. The moment of terror had arrived on the plain of Vigrid when time stood still. Odin, clad in his gleaming golden armor, wielding Gungnir, the spear of fate, and bearing the eight-legged Sleipnir beneath him, stood before the final test of history's greatest risk management. Opposite him stood Fenrir, the symbol of cosmic chaos, unleashed from its chains, its mouth wide enough to unite heaven and earth. Odin had prepared for this moment since the first day he learned from the runes that this wolf was his end. This was not merely a duel, it was the final reckoning between knowledge and savagery, between order and anarchy. Chapter 29. Odin's Farewell, Confrontation with the Wolf, and the Inevitable End. As Odin spurred Sleipnir and lunged toward the giant wolf, a film reel of millennia flashed before his eyes. The eye he left in Mimir's well, those agonizing 9 nights hanging in Yggdrasil, the thousands of heroes he gathered in Valhalla, and the sun fading with Baldur's departure. As a strategist, Odin already knew the mathematical outcome of this battle. Fenrir would devour him, but the greatness of a leader lay in taking that final step with the determination of someone destined for victory, even knowing the outcome would be absolute defeat. Gungnir cut through the air, aiming at Fenrir's heart. This was the system's final command for resistance.
As Fenrir charged forward with cosmic hunger, the Einherjar army and loyal gods surrounding Odin witnessed their leader's fall. As Odin was drawn into the wolf's dark throat, he was essentially sacrificing something, offering his own existence as the sacrifice necessary for the system's rebirth. An empire fails if its founder dies with it, but it is eternal if it can plant a new seed when its founder dies. As Odin disappeared between Fenrir's jaws, he knew his son Vidar was there to avenge him, tearing the wolf's mouth open and quelling this chaos. This was a pre-planned succession planning. Odin's farewell was not silent. Amidst the final echoes of the Gjallarhorn and the thunder of Thor's hammer, a closing symphony of an era played. Odin had accumulated knowledge throughout his life and transformed death into a strategy. In that final second, as Fenrir's darkness enveloped everything, Odin did not drop his spear. He was the first leader to say, "Knowledge is power," and he held on to that power until the very end of the universe. His death meant the fall of Asgard walls, but it also meant the inheritance of the secret of the runes to the survivors, Vidar, Vali, Magni, Modi, and Baldur, who would return.
An Odin who did not kneel, did not flee, and did not bargain with his fate. The moment he confronted the wolf, he was actually shouting a truth beyond all strategy. A leader must be both the architect of the system he creates and, when necessary, its greatest victim. With Odin's last breath, the runic code of the old world was erased. But this was not an end, but the completion of the great formatting process that Odin had envisioned from the very beginning. When the dust and smoke settled, all that remained of Odin in the bloody lands of Vigrid was a spear and a broken golden helmet. But his mind would continue to live on in the new sprouts of the 9 realms.
When the world sank and rose again, 2 humans, Lif and Lifthrosir, hidden deep within the roots of Yggdrasil, the tree of life, emerged from their refuge. This was Odin's greatest logistical feat, designing a sanctuary that would protect the seed even in the midst of the greatest catastrophe. Odin had strategized not only for the gods and warriors, but for the continuity of life itself. The new world awoke not with golden palaces and bloody wars as before, but with pure, green, and fresh hope. This was the successful restoration of the system's backup data. But the real miracle occurred on the divine level. Odin's sons, Vidar and Vali, and Thor's sons, Magni and Modi, rose from the ashes, inheriting their father's legacy and the legendary hammer Mjolnir. Most importantly, Baldur, Odin's greatest loss, returned, freed from the chains of Helheim. Although Odin's diplomacy to save Baldur seemed like a failure at the time, it was actually a long-term investment. Baldur ascended the throne as the clean and just leader of the new world. Odin, through his own death, cleansed the system, paving the way for a post-Ragnarok order where only the most meritorious would rule. The survivors found the golden game pieces Odin had once played with among the grass. This was a symbol of the transmission of the strategic knowledge of the past and the mystery of the runes to the new generation. Odin was gone, but his strategic legacy, his methods and teachings were encoded in the DNA of the new world. A leader's true success is ensuring the system continues to move in the right direction even in their absence. Odin envisioned Ragnarok not as an end, but as the greatest sacrifice and a necessary evolutionary leap for the sustainability of the universe. As the sun rose again, this new order, established upon the ruins of the 9 realms, was the fruit of Odin's wisdom. He understood he could not change fate, but he had succeeded in designing a world beyond fate. The survival protocol was complete. Fear had given way to merit and peace. As Odin watched this new beginning from Valhalla and beyond time, he once again proved how accurate a cost-benefit analysis his sacrifice of one eye and his death in the mouth of a wolf had been. The strategy was finished, but life, as Odin intended, was beginning anew.